Like, I think a lot of people treat replications as binary, as yes or no. But I think there's definitely many colors to it, many shades of gray, where maybe we don't see a result that we were expecting, but we learn something from that and we realize why we don't replicate it in that particular context, that particular scenario.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In Plain English. This is a special episode because I am joined by William Ngiam. He is a postdoctoral researcher and also one of the steering committee members of ReproducibiliTEA, which is an initiative to promote rigor and reproducibility in science. So, Will, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor. Thank you for welcoming me to this lovely podcast. I've had a chance to listen to a few episodes, and yeah, they're so lovely. I love the idea behind it, to try and put things in plain English. So yeah, it's perfect.
And do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a postdoc. So I kind of straddle both cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So my research is about attention and memory. And so funnily enough, what we hear about attention and memory often is that it's limited. Like, we have a very limited bandwidth or limited attention span. And that to me means that it's really important what captures our attention or what enters into our attention. And so you can imagine, once I started thinking about that, I started realizing, scientists need to realize that their attention needs to be put on the right things as well. And so that's how I ended up in this. So I've kind of got two sides of my scientific sort of career. I've got the researching attention and memory and how that is in the brain, but also I'm curious about how scientists operate and what they have in mind and how they go about doing their science. So yeah, that's broadly my two focuses in my postdoc.
That is super interesting. And that, kind of immediately brings up a lot of things for me. Mostly, I feel like my attention is pulled everywhere all at once. And I'm just a grad student. I, imagine that by the time you get to the PI level and you're overseeing several different projects and many personnel within your lab, that how you direct your attention is really important. Like
zooming out at like a level, it's not just within science. I feel like there's this general feeling in the world, in the general population, that our attention is being like grabbed and like taken over. Like, for example, we've got social media and the digital age kind of bombarding you with a bunch of content, and content that you don't get to decide. The algorithms feed you certain content, and so that enters your attention. And also the idea that misinformation and disinformation, you don't really know what to trust anymore. So that those kind of things, like, I feel like there's a general sort of vibe in the world right now that our attention and our ability to focus and our ability to think is kind of being pulled and stretched a little. So yeah, so it's not just scientists. I think it's like everyone. Yeah.
I'm going to grab onto the misinformation and disinformation thread and kind of use that to bring us to our main topic for today, which is talking about rigor and reproducibility in science, and then how that connects with how we bring science to the public attention and counter misinformation and disinformation and general distrust in science that is out there.
Yeah, for sure. Those are definitely relevant threads. And it's a thing that scientists should be reckoning with. And I think it's sort of, speaking about attention, it's sort of left scientists' attention, this idea that we should be standing up for, what is knowledge and what is the public, thinking about and understanding. We should be contributing to that and have our, expertise and voices being heard. But nowadays, this seems to be on shaky ground. So yeah, it's a problem that scientists need to think about.
To take an example of COVID, because we all are thinking about COVID and the COVID vaccine, there is this, wonderful and, kind of remarkable science that went into developing the COVID vaccine. And that was a huge breakthrough and a unprecedented rollout. But the way that I feel like the public attention and opinion on the COVID vaccine is so fractured, and there's almost like, it's not so much that scientists are contributing this like new knowledge and technology to the world so much as like, you have one kind of knowledge over here and then you have this other kind of knowledge over there, and the other kind of knowledge is perhaps not true about the world, but it's being allowed to flourish because, well, I don't know. That's maybe that's something we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it was a very remarkable thing to have the vaccines created so quickly and built upon amazing science. But somehow it got lost in what happened in the events that transpired. A lot of different voices had their say and sort of added noise to the signal. And scientists, and especially medical doctors, like let's say the people who were trying to push the message were drowned out. And of course, with a lower signal, then it's harder for the public to sort of evaluate and get the sense of what's right and what's going on. And again, harkening back to the early things we've already been talking about, like they don't have control over what they see or hear, or whether they can critically evaluate things in a manner that allows them to sift through what seems right or what the scientists are saying and what's not. So all of this blends together into a problem or a mess that scientists sort of need to react to and figure out something to do about it. And I think, yes, not to go off topic too much, but rigor, like research rigor and reproducibility is one step towards a solution, in my opinion, on how we can improve our messaging and again, puts with rigor and reproducibility and transparency in mind, it will put into focus how scientists message or communicate their understanding and expertise and research to public for it to be a common good. So obviously those things are related there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's contributing to the noise that's kind of drowning out the signal is not just disinformation that's coming from outside of the scientific community, but from within science itself. There's been a lot of press and attention around how many like scientific articles end up not being able to be reproduced, which I'm kind of building up to that, and sort of how much science gets wrong. And I feel like this leads to a lot of distrust. And so, yeah, I think something I'd love to talk about is then finally defining what reproducibility is, and then talking about how that can kind of set our house in order, and then how we can use that to build public trust in science.
Yeah, awesome. I suppose let me ask you a question about how would you define reproducibility, especially being an early career scientist, at least more junior than I am.
Yeah. So I think it involves a couple of different components, but at sort of the most basic level, it's the ability to take either a technique, experiment, or set of data and do the same thing that the original researchers did and get the same result, or a result that's kind of, in a ballpark, because there's always going to be noise, especially in biology, psychology, social sciences. There's going to be quite a lot of noise. In physics and chemistry, there might be significantly less. But, that involves both repeating experiments and also in more data science, like taking a data set and applying an analysis and being able to get the same result.
Yes. You've touched on all the threads. So let me try and distill them into a few components. So the first one, doing an experiment and repeating it and getting the same thing, I would sort of couch that under something like empirical reproducibility, like the ability to redo the experiment and get a result that should reflect what was originally observed. We'll go through the different definitions. So there's that. And then we have computational reproducibility, which is like getting the data and being able to reproduce the results or the analyses that the scientists did. So there's sort of two arms there. And then the third part that you touched on is how often should our replications be successful? You sort of said, yeah, there's, of course, you're going to have some conceptual replications, going to be some noise. And I think that's also been missing in the conversation. It's not simply that scientists, the way we do science in the modern age, everything 100% of the time will be exactly as we observe. There are definitely many different covariates or confounding variables that we don't know or that we don't have control over yet. So it's this idea that science doesn't always get everything right all the time. There is a rate, an expected rate. So for example, there are things that we're pretty sure about and that we should see most of the time. But there are also some things that we're not so sure about and that we're sort of exploring, but we're kind of going on a random walk and in the right-ish direction. It's sort of this idea, I think a lot of people treat replications as binary, as yes or no. But I think there's definitely many colors to it, many shades of gray, where maybe we don't see a result that we were expecting, but we learn something from that and we realize why we don't replicate it in that particular context, or that particular scenario. So those three things together encapsulate this definition of reproducibility. It's not just whether you can empirically reproduce or computationally reproduce these results, but also comparing it to how often it should replicate, or how often it should replicate in this specific context. So I think that's that nuance has been missing in the conversation for quite a while.
Yeah. And I think something else I've been thinking about whether or not would be housed under reproducibility or an adjacent concept is reproducibility across species. I work with mice and we find out a lot about mice brains. We can do so many things to them to learn about the specific ways that all of the different pathways and areas of the brain work. And then, some of that translates to humans. We're both mammals. The broad brain structure is more or less the same. But the specifics are very different, obviously. And as one of the senior researchers in my department likes to say, mice are not tiny humans. So I think maybe I'd like to house another concept under reproducibility, which is being able to get something that works in mice. How do we translate? And I guess this is translation, but I think it kind of is an adjacent concept. How do we translate that to people?
Yeah, the term that comes to my mind is generalizability. So I work entirely with humans, but humans themselves have differences. For example, cultural differences. What we might see in Western populations might not be the same in other cultures. So, for example, this concept of weird countries, or weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized. I've got the rich, I think, and developed. So those countries are where a lot of the research is being done, but who's to say that research generalizes to other human populations that don't often make contact with the science that we're doing? So yeah, I would couch that under generalizability, and that's definitely a related factor in reproducibility, and harks back to the idea when should we expect things to replicate or not? And when is that okay?
Right. Because with people, an observation in one group of people in one specific cultural context might not, you could do that same thing somewhere entirely different and think that you're going to get the same result and then be totally surprised and be like, I don't know, why did that happen? Absolutely.
And then, but that's an exciting moment because you can then be okay, why did it? We totally expected that to replicate and it didn't. There's something we don't know. We don't know what's happening. And so that allows further investigation into that empirical phenomena to try and figure out what's going on. So yeah, we're already sort of discussing the idea of reproducibility in a more nuanced way. And I think how that's communicated to the public, I think in the public's, in their mind's eye, they expect this sort of science should always work. It should always be 100%. If they know what's going on, then they should be able to get a result or have an understanding or have an explanation all the time. And the reality is that the world is so complex that, of course, scientists can't meet this ridiculous, impossible standard of being able to almost play God and control everything. So I think in the communication of how science is reproducibility crisis, what's missing when that's communicated to the public is we should expect some things not to work out. That's just how science works. And so that nuance is missing to the public, and then they sort of react and they see, oh, none of the things that they're doing replicates or works out, or they can't even reproduce the results, and so that they get a panicked message rather than the nuanced message that we're talking about in our conversation.
Right. And I think like that even has roots in how we internally talk about science and talking about like my experience worked or it didn't work, right? Like this is probably not a helpful framework. So I think, yeah, maybe that would be useful to talk about is like, how do we think about science that maybe doesn't contribute towards this nuanced view of like what we're actually doing and what we actually want to be able to convey to people about our work.
Yeah, for sure. So what comes to my mind is like, let's talk about some numbers, right? So we know that, or it's estimated approximately 3 million articles, scientific articles is published per year. And we know the amount of those experiments or those studies that purport a significant result or positive finding is about 90 to 95% of those papers. So that's a ton of papers claiming something. And it's just can't be the reality that scientists are that good at finding significant positive results. There's definitely going to be some noise in that signal. Looking at registered reports, which is another way to do science. So registered reports is when scientists give their protocol or their methods to a peer to review, and so they can tighten up any confounds that they may have missed and so on and so forth. And the work is published so long as you follow the protocol that you wrote out in the first stage. The reason I bring those up is that the positive finding rate in those registered reports is estimated closer to 40 to 50% in some of the recent estimates that I've seen, which is qualitatively
dramatically different to
95% that's in the traditional literature, as scientists might talk about. So the reason I bring up those numbers is I think that the difference between a traditional paper that gets published and the registered report is that the metric of success is different. Whereas it seems like we talk about something called publication bias. Scientists think that positive significant findings are the things that will get them published. And that's the carrot that they're, aiming for. That's the incentive. So naturally, scientists will do a lot of things to, whether in a known fashion or in an unconscious, subtly biased fashion, to generate those positive findings or those impactful results, or to claim positive, like very impactful results, when the reality is it's probably not as impactful as they claim it is. I think you touched on something very important there when you said like it worked or it didn't work. It's like, no, the goal here isn't to have a significant positive finding with our research. The goal is to try and expand our understanding of the system or the phenomena that we're researching, or so on and so forth. And so we lack the culture and the words to sort of talk about how science is operating in a way that moves us away from things worked or things were good or things were replicated in a sort of dichotomous yes-no fashion towards a more nuanced, like, yeah, it didn't work this time but we learned this thing, or I was surprised that it didn't work. And that surprise moment led to learning, or was an opportunity to learn. So yeah, all these kind of factors like bubble into this collective problem that scientists are trying to deal with at the moment.
Yeah, I think that hits on a lot of things that I've been thinking about. And I've been very interested in registered reports recently. I had known about them as a concept maybe for about a year, but I visited at Society for Neuroscience, which was where I saw you on that panel and was like, I have to reach out to you. But I also visited the Community for Rigor booth, and they were talking about registered reports as like a component of rigorous science, because you kind of go through peer review first, which to me, like, that kind of sounds smart. Why are we waiting until we've done all the stuff and then we give it to somebody and they're like, wait, but you should have done different stuff. And then you're like, well, I did all this stuff. Don't you like my stuff?
Right. It's weird, right? And there's like a weird, like, I spent all this time, there's a sunk cost to it. Like, I spent all this time doing this stuff and I think it's exciting. Like, and I couldn't have known, or like, no one told me like this was like, weird, or like I could have done this better. And I think that kind of feedback is really important and really missing in science. We've tried at other scientific conferences to push something called the pre-data poster. So traditionally at scientific conferences, you have people present their research after they've done the experiments, and you get a ton of great feedback and so on and so forth. But usually it'd be in the context of, you already have the data, like maybe you could do these secondary analyses or correct for these things, but there's no real way to take that feedback and and have it change your design, or you may have to redo the experiment again. So you have to invest more resources into the thing, when science can be expensive, or especially with, like, for example, with animal research, you don't want to use up animal resources or animals' lives without carefully, making sure you're doing the right thing or have sorted out these confounds.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to kind of waste things that, they're alive. They're, a valuable resource, not just in terms of like time and money, but also in terms of like, you want to respect the mice and not just use them for random bullshit.
Right. Absolutely. So to me, it's just been like that feedback has been missing. That sort of quality assurance from an early stage in the research design is, you only really get that from your discussions with the supervisor, but not really from someone independent who's like sort of zoomed out a little and being like, wait, hang on, like, did you think about this thing? And so, I think, so registered reports touches on that, where you do have to write a pre-registration, a protocol of what you're going to do. And it allows someone the opportunity to get in and give you feedback before you've done it, and like, and a moment where you're flexible, you're adaptable, you're not like already sunk a bunch of things into how you've done it and you can't change it afterwards. Like, so that's the philosophy behind registered reports, and it seems to be more rigorous, just based on, for example, that the proportion of positive findings found in those registered reports, it's no longer at this 90 to 95%. It's closer to half, maybe a bit under, depending on the subdiscipline. So because people are doing things that think should be done, and they're not sort of the things that don't work, they're putting in the file. They're not fishing around exactly for what might work or what looks like it might be impactful or produce a significant finding.
Yeah. And I think too that just shifting towards more registered reports, and the fact that shifts that proportion of significant findings, I think that would probably start to change the like culture and public understanding around science. Because when you're seeing, all the reports that you see about science, that like, especially the ones that filter down to people who are not reading all of the literature, is these like really big, grand findings. That's like, oh, we found this huge thing. And when that's all you see of science, then you're like, these people, they like know what they're doing. They understand the world. They're like finding out new things. They're always, hitting the bullseye, right? But if that were to shift on account of these registered reports, and there's more of kind of a balance between, we tested our hypothesis about the world and we were right, or we tested our hypothesis about the world and we were wrong, and here's why. I think that even just that being more of the what's out there in science would do a lot to start shifting the conversation. Because right now it does look like, scientists are just right, and they're just like, nothing but net all the time.
No, totally. I think that message matters for scientists to hear, so that scientists know not everyone is like, a rock star and like figures it out first try or whatever. Like, scientists need to like accept that, a lot of things are complex and messy and noisy, and, a lot of things we get wrong. But I also think, for the science communicators and the public, that's a great message to hear. Like, it's so fun when a science communicator is actually like, we have no idea. Scientists, we don't know how this thing works, and we're trying to figure it out, but this is our best guess, and sort of like couch the context in like, yeah, we don't know. That's why we're studying this thing.
If we knew, we wouldn't have to do the science. And I was actually listening to one of the Reproducibility podcast episodes that I think relates to this, which was talking about how like oftentimes we can't even really say that we're wrong with a lot of confidence because we don't have a great framework to ground things. And we're still trying to figure out the model and the framework that we should be situating our questions inside of. And until then, you said it earlier, we're kind of like wandering around in the dark and like, oh, we found this thing over here. We found that thing over here. How do they link together? There's like 20 steps in between them, and we don't have that picture at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, so like the toy model that you're taught in sort of, let's say, high school science is that you do the scientific method. You do this thing, it replicates, you get the result, and that's how knowledge is gained. But then if you go through more of a philosophy of science route, you realize it's not just like a straight recipe that generates knowledge or understanding or like it leads to perfect understanding of everything or the reality. There's a lot of theorizing and like tinkering around and exploration and like integrating that needs to be done in science. One of my favorite examples, a great philosopher of science who inspires me is Paul Feyerabend, and he's sort of a bit of a scientist defeatist. So he's not the best idol to have, but he talks about in his book Against Method how like Galileo figured out like things aren't rotating around us, we're rotating around the sun. And Galileo didn't have all the answers then. He had the telescope and he had some pretty good math and pretty good like understanding to put the pieces together. But it took a lot to provide, to be able to convince enough people for them to really accept that as a competing theory, right? And even in those times, the church were like, hang on, like, you haven't figured it out yet. Galileo didn't even understand the optics of the telescope, like didn't understand how the light worked out to produce the image that he was looking and making conclusions on. So, another example, another favorite book of mine, Inventing Temperature by Ha-Seok Chang. How did we invent the thermometer? Like, you can't use another thermometer and say, yeah, this thermometer measures the same thing as this thermometer. No, that's circular. So you need like a theory and an understanding of what temperature is. And it took a really long time to figure out, temperature is actually kinetic energy. Like, it took a very long time to figure out that heat wasn't just some force. It was, it's actually the kinetic energy, and results in pressure and movement and kinetic and all that kind of stuff. So I wish the world could have that like little bit of nuanced understanding there, where they're like, yeah, actually science has this messiness to it and needs these theories to figure out what things are, and we can have a practical understanding before we can have a really new developed understanding of the system that we're trying to study.
I think something that illustrates this really well that has fascinated me since I first learned about it in undergrad is how implants to treat Parkinson's disease symptoms work, which it's kind of it's brain surgery. So you're going into someone's brain, you're putting a little tiny metal electrode in a part of their brain, and the patient can turn it on, and it reduces the like hand shaking and other motor symptoms that you get with Parkinson's disease. We figured this out because someone was doing brain surgery for a different reason and messed up this area of the brain, was like, whoa, I guess that works. And obviously researchers have been working on, so we figured out the practical side first. We figured out like we can stimulate this area of the brain and cause a reduction in the like motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But why? And we're still in the but why phase. We don't totally know, because some of these areas of the brain, you can activate them or inhibit them and it'll cause the same outcome. In some patients, activating a particular area, has the desired effect, and in other patients, activating the exact same area does not have the desired effect. And so that gets back to your context of like, well, we're not going to throw this idea out and say it doesn't work because in some patients it doesn't work. We have to understand now. We need to go a level deeper and be like, what is different between these patients that makes it work in some people but not others? Like, what's the context of the brain? And we're still in that. So yeah, we have the practical knowledge, and we're still working on like the theory to build around that and figure out why that works.
And if we had figured it out, we wouldn't be doing the science. We'd be able to do the thing that we want and like make the applications that we need. But clearly we have a lack of understanding there. So we need to keep doing it. And then maybe we can improve our practical tools to provide the benefits that science is promising. I think that's another component of the discussion that's missing, is that I think scientists have lost sight of the fact that science is meant to be a common good. Like scientists, the end result is, whether it's, even if it's not practical, even if it's just basic science trying to develop an understanding of something, that should be communicated to the public for the public to benefit from, because it should be a common knowledge, right? And so I think a notion of what we've been talking about includes transparency, right? So transparency between scientists, like within the scientific community to each other, because we need to build something upon trust. We can't individually do all the experiments in the world to figure out something. So we have to rely on each other a little bit. So that relies on trust, and trust necessitates a bit of transparency. But also with the public, it's the same. We need to be transparent about what we're doing and what we're thinking. And I think at the moment, we're not completely transparent with the public with how we do our forms, or how we do our research, or how we decide what gets done, or who becomes the scientists. There's that obscurity there that sort of makes things a little tricky, and that obscurity actually adds noise to the messaging to the public. I think this move to be reproducible and rigorous involves this move to be more transparent and to think about and better think about how we communicate our science. A rant of mine often is that scientists, we have not modernized how we communicate our science. We still stick our work in outdated journal articles in boxes that are behind paywalls, that generate a bunch of profit for these scientific publishing companies that don't return to the scientists. It's a ridiculous system that everyone who's involved should realize is a total inefficient structure. And so, I think a push thinking with the mindset that science should be a common good, or at least something that is consumable by the public. If you believe that to be true, then that necessitates communication of the work that isn't behind paywalls, or that is designed specifically to communicate the results to the public, which may involve an additional form of scholarly output that isn't a paper. Like the paper can be for scientist to scientist, fine. But, at some point, we've also got to be, reaching out to the public and communicating and getting in a sort of building a trust and a transparency with them, so that they understand, hey, the scientists know what they're doing, or are to be trusted when an issue comes up that scientists are trying to fix or trying to, apply and say, hey, this is what we know about it, and we think we should do this, or this thing is coming, we should react for it, or be prepared for it. They're like, okay, yeah, we can trust what the scientists are saying, which, collectively we haven't been seeing in recent times.
No, because there's really no format, mechanism, forum, place to do that. It doesn't exist. Science communication is a very currently individual or small group level endeavor where, some individuals care about it a lot and try to communicate their science to the public in addition to other people in their field. Some people make a career out of it and work for companies or nonprofits in sort of a science communication arm. Some people go into science journalism and will write stories about scientific articles, but the filter of what gets to that point is sort of even more skewed than the filter of what gets to publishing in the first place. There is not a systematic way that makes it accessible and interesting. Something that we're going to go all the way back to your attention. Something that people should direct their attention towards and should want to direct their attention towards and say why not understand about how this thing is? And I'm going to go here and there's a place where I can go to get an idea of what this research is about. And there's ways for me to then find the deeper, technical papers and documents if I want to. But there's also this top level that I can go to and learn about science and the world. And yeah, that.
No, absolutely. Like, it does seem to be missing. I mean, there are some outlets. So, for example, The Conversation, that I forgot what the tagline is. Something like academic publishing with a journalistic flair, something like this. And, some of my favorite science communicators, Ed Yong, who's great, who writes for The Atlantic. And there's a lot of books in the public space that communicate a lot of good science. You saw a lot come out of COVID. So, for example, Breath, I think by James Nestor, I want to say, was a fairly good book that sort of demystified some of the things that were being talked about during COVID. So, it's there, but it's not really a priority, or doesn't seem to be highlighted, and the structures don't really work together.
You kind of have to create your own little thing.
Right.
My podcast is my own little thing. That's kind of trying to highlight some research, but I am but one person. And even if I scale up my ability to do this by 10-fold or 100-fold, that's still a minute fraction of science.
Right. And a part of it is that you might consider this work as volunteer or service, or, in addition to your research career, when really I think the incentive structures should be that this is recognized as a scientific output, or something that you should be recognized for moving forward as in your career as a scientist. But those structures aren't really there, and because the structures, the ways we do science, don't really think about, our product or our output should be to the public, so we need an arm for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because and I think that thinking of science as a public good is kind of almost a radical idea in science, because I don't think we treat it that way. I mean, publishing certainly doesn't treat it that way. But even if we leave aside how publishing works, I don't think that scientists really treat it that way. You need to, oftentimes, either you read conversations on Twitter, which are not really well communicated most of the times, or you have to pay a lot of money to go to a conference to find out what scientists are talking about, which is also not treating it as a public good.
Right. It's weird, right? And in a world where information is sort of becoming more readily available. For example, I watched a fantastic public lecture by Carl Bergstrom for AMOS. AMOS is the Association for Interdisciplinary Metascience and Open Science. That public lecture is on YouTube. You can find these kind of public lectures if you search for these scientists who are giving talks, and it's great. Anyway, Carl gave a great talk talking about how information it used to be where you had to kind of forage for it and spend time with that information. For example, you had to borrow a book out of the library rather than having it readily accessible at your fingertips. But nowadays, a lot of information is readily accessible at your fingertips, and you can just scroll through and find things. But beyond that, you don't even have control over what gets shown up. We have built this way to just scroll an endless pit of information or content that just comes at you that is basically unregulated, or it's, to be more precise, it's the algorithms are defined in a way to keep you scrolling. And what keeps you scrolling isn't necessarily the most informative or educational thing or even healthy thing. It's things that will make you react, make you, emotionally charged, such as some of the content that you probably see on Twitter, even from scientists who are arguing, right? Because that's what the platform wants to generate.
Yeah, everything I see on science Twitter is controversy, argument, and that's not entirely bad, but it's also not done with an aim towards achieving understanding. It's done, Twitter incentivizes doing this with the aim of being correct and getting you being viewed as correct and getting the most people to jump in and be yeah, that guy's correct.
But that's not the only way science happens, and the only way science conversations happen, which is it's such a tiny slice of how science actually operates that it's almost not worth basing anything on sometimes. Yeah. So scientists haven't adjusted for that. I think scientists haven't really even though, we've becoming more modern and more advanced with a lot of our skills, and we have built structures for like open data sharing and communicating and all this stuff, we haven't really taken the next step of really taking control, and sorry, maybe not taking control, but having agency in how we do the science, rather than letting these platforms decide how we communicate the science or what is deemed good science. And I don't think scientists have had that light bulb moment where they realize, wait, what we're doing is sort of not helpful for us. Back to attention. Like, we have incentive structures and goals and things like that take up our attention. And sometimes we need the reminders to step back and zoom out and be like, wait, what is the purpose of what we do? And what is the collective aim of all scientists, right? The collaboration of what we're doing built upon each other's research and understanding and conversations, discussion. What is the goal of that in the end? And it's, to leave a lasting, hopefully positive impact on the world, I think.
Yeah. I'm not doing science so that I personally can get tenure. Like, that's a pretty circular idea of why you do science. But the incentive structures that exist within hiring and getting grants and, advancing in your career kind of make it so that the more salient thing on your mind is, how do I get to the next stage of my career? Because, like, self-evidently, if you don't do those things and you don't get to the next stage of your career, then you can no longer do what science is actually for. But I think all of that ends up overshadowing what science is actually for.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to fight those things. But in recent years, I think scientists have finally come together and realize these problems and actually trying to fix these things. So AMOS, I mentioned just now, is a collective of scientists who are like, yep, meta science, we need to do research about research and understand how it operates and have evidence for why the things we do things are maybe not the best way, or get evidence for the ways we're changing things is improving things. And there's now a movement. So one would call it the credibility revolution. That's what Samin Vizier sort of termed the whole, if there's a reproducibility crisis, there's also been a response. And that response is the credibility revolution, that scientists are, doing the things to try and promote the rigor and the reproducibility and the transparency and the openness and the impact of science. So even though there's a lot like going wrong, scientists are still fixing it, just like we're tinkering around with other stuff as well, and we're also tinkering around with the way we do science. And I think that's also an important message for the public to hear too. We're not just blindly hoping for the best, we're thinking about how we're doing stuff and trying to fix it. So I think that's an important thing to say as well.
There's so much like creativity and experimentation in the realm of, how do we do science? How do we publish science? How do we do statistics about science? And how do we communicate science? I mean, in the realm of publishing, as of a few months ago, I don't know what eLife is doing right now, but they were kind of doing a lot of interesting things in how they do peer review, which is, when some of your academic peers get together and, or not get together, but like review your article and try to figure out, like, is this good? Do we think this is ready to be disseminated to the public? Do you need to do more things? eLife has been messing around with that. You had a conversation with someone, I forget his name. He was a very interesting person, but he works on this thing called the Unjournal.
Oh, yes. David Reinstein. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that the Unjournal, their model was very creative in how they were thinking about being more of a platform for
the actual evaluation of the research.
Rather than like, they're not trying to be a journal despite their name. They're trying to evaluate and provide some kind of like predictive value to scientists and provide some kind of like, oh, this has validity, or this has like merit to publish something here, and kind of make it. And even some of the like more technical details that he was talking about, not having it be this like linear paper that you read from top to bottom and you get results. That's not even how scientists read papers. Like, right. Why are we doing it this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of those kind of initiatives. So at a higher level, I think scientists need to be more open to these kind of things and be a little bit more pluralistic. Scientists, are trained to see things as problems and to have solutions for the problems, and those once you have the solution, those problems go away. But a lot of the things that we're talking about are complex problems that require ongoing solutions and ongoing thought. So I think scientists need to think a little bit more about, not treating it as sort of binary, like this will be fixed when it gets fixed, but as actually I need to like prioritize and actually think about how I'm doing this continually. And so if you accept that kind of chaos, maybe this is my own chaotic element coming to the fore, but like I think science should accept like we need to be trying a lot more things. We should be allowing a lot more tinkering with, for example, the public publishing system, which David is doing with the Unjournal, where he's trying to publish the evaluations of the research and create a platform where you can trust the research because it's been evaluated by a credible platform, and you can see the evaluations. You can also rate the evaluations or scale the evaluations in a way that is useful for you. So like, I think like, yeah, it's fun to think about those things and to see people trying to shake things up a little.
Peer Community In is doing a similar thing of having a platform where scientists in a particular field can get together and you put your research out there and it kind of gets evaluated. I think when I started this podcast, and then more specifically when I started talking to people about open science, I mean, I did interview Michael Eisen and Alexandra Elbakian, who is the founder of Sci-Hub, a science piracy website. And when I talked to them, which was just earlier this year, I think that I had in mind, like, science is going to arrive at like the solution to publishing. We are going to replace this singular old model that we have with a singular new model that is going to be good and correct. And I think that in the months since that conversation, I've kind of updated my thinking. And it's like, there's not going to be one solution to publishing. And that maybe that's part of the problem, is that we have currently, at least in the United States, one model of publishing. There's going to be many different solutions to publishing. It's going to be context dependent, like what you were talking about earlier with research, which is context dependent. And it's going to be kind of flexible and constantly updating, because we don't know how technology is going to progress. We are still, only barely being able to, we're not really making use of the internet as a technology to communicate research maximally. And then who knows what's going to come next. So I think, yeah, there needs to be many models of how we do science better, how we communicate science better, and they need to be kind of constantly updating.
Yeah, absolutely. That I agree with you 100%. I think we've been stuck with this printing press model for a bit too long. We've let it sort of take control of us, to be frank. And yeah, it's about time we sort of think about that a little bit more carefully, reconsidered what scholarly outputs are and should be. And from that, we could really make strides into how we communicate our research, or how we do our research, or how we focus our research. All these things are sort of open game for the right for change. And I think that's exciting. That's a really exciting thing to be a part of, because you can really have impactful changes on how things are done going into the future. If you accept all the sort of things we've been talking about, one of the common things that is also missing from the conversation is hope. Even though we've criticized a lot of things in this conversation and talked about how things aren't so great, there's an important message that scientists are trying to fix these things, and the criticism comes with hope. We care enough to want it to be better, so that's why we are criticizing, and we have hope for things can be better, and that we have agency in making things better. And so that's like a really important message, I think, that needs to come through as well. That I think scientists need to be a bit more like future thinking and being like, yes, we're trying to make things better in the future at a point that will be beyond when we perish and die. Like those impacts, we're going to move, long into the future, we hope.
Ideally.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, but we need to go in with that hope. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of people, or at least on Twitter, which maybe this is not accurate, but a lot of people approaching these experiments and innovations in publishing, for example, with like, well, why are you doing that? Like, that sucks. I don't like this. This has these flaws. And it's like, yes, it has flaws because we're people and we're flawed and we make flawed systems that don't work in every situation.
Yeah, right. There's a humility, I think, that comes with we're being accepting that, right? Like, yeah, maybe like we don't know a lot. And because we don't know a lot, that means we shouldn't be so quick to judge or knock things down. Maybe we should let things grow and see what comes up. And maybe we can also change our minds and realize, oh, actually, that did better than I expected, or this way to publish makes more sense now than it did to me back when publishing was when I was used to doing it this way. All important insights to sort of have, and I think it's starting to become part of the conversation, the discussion that's happening nowadays in science. I sense it growing.
Right. I think it's only gaining steam from when I started my graduate education to now. I think it's gained steam over just like 4 years.
And that's exciting. I mean, I always talk about how early career researchers, you don't often hear about them in this sort of reform movement. You usually hear about like professors or whoever, the top brass, are doing the work. But so it's often forgotten that the early career researchers are the next generation of scientists who are going to take these structures and are going to work within these structures. And so for you to say, oh yeah, like this has already been, I'm already hearing about it and like changing how I'm doing things or reacting, I think that's a really hopeful sign that like things are going to be for the better sooner than we think.
Yeah. And also early career researchers have a lot of power, maybe not in the ways that, a tenured professor has power, but I think I've witnessed that oftentimes people in those positions of power have bought into the existing system so much that they feel as though they cannot change things because they're so entrenched in their ways and what got them to that position. But there are many more early career researchers than there are senior tenured professors. And, I think something else since we're talking about things that are missing in this conversation very often is I think that a lot of conversation around how to improve science communication, improve publishing, improve, whatever facet of science you're talking about is very focused on individuals or like small groups of people. Yeah, I think that the role of collective action of early career researchers is under discussed and perhaps our power underutilized.
Absolutely. 100%. Totally agree with you. I mean, my main involvement with open science has been something through reproducibility, which is the initiative to try and get early career researchers to form community around open science and get that agency to really make a change, even at their local institution. And once a lot of the goal or the hope is like if a lot of early career researchers at different institutions band together and try and figure out the best way to do things, you're going to get this critical mass where suddenly it becomes a big part of the conversation, which forces changes in the existing structures towards a hopeful, more positive type of science. So yeah, absolutely. 100% would love to empower any junior scientist or any early career researcher to try and get involved in the movement in your own little way, even through having these conversations with your mentors or with your lab mates or with someone else or with a friend who's not in science, like in the public, being like, hey, what do you think about science, or how do you consume your content? Just starting those conversations and having that in mind and doing things about it, I think it's a really empowering and important thing to do. So yeah, fingers crossed. That's been my main message for a long time, for a few years, hoping to try and encourage early career researchers to be part of this. And I think it's happening. I think we're getting there. Hopefully.
Yeah. One thing that I had been thinking about when we were talking about all these experiments and shifts in publishing is that the underlying way that we think about our ideas and our research, and I think needs to change, which is maybe a bit more of a difficult thing. But if we want to be more open and transparent with our research, if we want to maximize sharing ideas and collaboration, this model of like man or a woman or a non-binary person is at the head of the lab and they are kind of directing the research, and then all the papers that are written within that lab have one person that's at the helm of it, and in conjointly with the head of the lab. And, these minds are chugging along to, they had this grand idea and they're going to do this. As much as I think a lot of people would kind of hate to give that up, I think that idea of how science works and how progress is made and how ideas work needs to change. And then also the incentive structure around being that person who has the idea that does the experiment that gets the result also needs to change. This is a huge topic, but
No, absolutely. I know. I love that you bring that up. Yes, absolutely. So I've got so many threads going on in my mind about that. So let me start with an example. I think one of the most exciting science collaborations that in my lifetime, in our lifetime, I think, was for me, it comes from the realm of math. It's the distance between primes. What is the smallest gap between? I'm explaining this terribly because I'm not a skilled mathematician. There's a theorem where you could try and figure out what figuring out prime numbers is really important, basically, and figuring out the gaps between prime numbers also very important. So, how far can we get with repeating primes? And so the reason I bring this up is that the math community came together, and rather than just have one person tackle this problem and try and figure out a proof or solution, it became a really big community effort in something that resulted in, it's called polymath, where they had this benchmark and they all came together and tried to get this benchmark as low as possible. And that seemed to me as an exciting way to make progress on something, rather than just have one person sit at their table or do the experiments and figure it out themselves. It was a huge collaborative effort with all the same goal and all invested and contributing ideas and contributing how to do this thing. You see this in bigger scale science like James Webb Telescope, Large Hadron Collider, all these examples. And in psychology, we've recently had the Psychology Science Accelerator, which sort of operates on those models too. Yeah, so and that all means hey, it's not going to be one genius that's going to figure it all out. It's probably we're going to make more progress faster with a collective of scientists that we all work and contribute. And it's not about who gets the reward or who gets the cherry at the end.
Who's first author? Who gets the grant?
None of that. All of that superfluous stuff just goes away. It no longer matters. And you're right. For people to get to that stage, it requires a lot of rethinking. Ironically, one of the books that reached the general population, I say reached, was published, is a book by Adam Grant, who's a professor in marketing. He's a very famous popular science writer. And he wrote this book called Think Again. And I think the byline is The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, something like this. And throughout the book, he's saying you should think like a scientist. Scientists are very good at not knowing what they don't know and blah, blah, blah. And know when to be uncertain and know how things can seem like they're clear, but in actuality, they're not, and things like that. And throughout that whole book, I was thinking, no, scientists need to also hear that message, to think again, to rethink. Yeah. And I think if there's one important key here, it's that scientists should be open to rethinking. That's almost your job. You should be a rethinker, be willing to rethink the assumptions that you're in your research, or the way you do the research, or how you do the experiments, or what models, and so on and so forth. All of that should be baked into how you approach doing science, in my opinion. So yeah, those sort of two things together are very related, and it's critical. I think it's if there's a way to have more scientists realize that or think in that way, we're going to see a lot more positive work, a lot more progressive science, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I love the example that you gave in math, because that sounds really cool. Just everybody, put your heads together. We're all gonna figure out how we solve this problem. Yeah, it obviously is so anathema to, at least in life sciences, how we do things and all of the incentive structures. And it really just you start drilling into this and you realize everything needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds daunting, but in another way, it just shows that there's progress to be made. And I think that's exciting in some ways. yes, we could be the first generation of scientists that rethink all of these models and come up with something that really fundamentally improves how science is being done. And I think that's crazy. That's like super, super exciting.
We don't have to accept how things are, and we don't have to just sit around and complain. Like, you can start to do things, or you can take a huge problem that many different groups working on individually would never be able to solve, and you can put it out there and be like, hey, let's all kind of take a bite of this huge problem and maybe we'll get somewhere a little bit faster. I would like, I mean, obviously there's larger scale collaborations in neuroscience, but I would kind of love to see something formalized, like a neuroscience research accelerator.
Yeah, being like within neuroscience, you hear about the stories of like, oh, it's always the richest labs or the resource labs that get to do the exciting stuff. And like that just, and then you hear about like scientists withholding their ideas. They're like, I'm holding onto this experiment design because like I don't want anyone else to know, or I don't want those richest labs
can't get scooped. Yeah.
Operating with that like burden, that like just stress, it's just clearly to me a sign that like things need to change. Like this can't be the way to do it.
How do we change science so that we can let go of that stress? And I was going to say the number, so at SFN, for the audience, there's thousands of people presenting posters on their research. And some, like, I was presenting a poster on research that I had already put out as a preprint, which kind of what you were saying earlier, that's maybe not so helpful. Like, what am I going to do with the feedback that I get? The paper's already out there. But, you know, a lot of people are presenting research in progress. They have some data, but not all of it. They haven't gotten around to publishing it yet, etc. And are justifiably in this current context worried about being quote unquote scooped, having someone come by and be like, that's a cool idea, and I have 15 postdocs, so I can just go forward with this and put out a paper before you do. So SFN has a way to mitigate this, which is you put a little red camera with an X through it over your poster, or like on top of your poster. And that's like, you know, you can't record this. You can't, you know, take a picture of it. And I think it's kind of sad. Like, I don't think it's sad. I don't blame individual researchers for doing this. There's obviously reasons why this has to be in place, but I think it's sad that it needs to.
It's a weird behavior, right? Like, it's weirdly guarded in a way that seems antithetical to how scientists and how scientific conferences should be operating. Because what are scientific conferences for if not to communicate stuff between each other?
Right. I have this thing and you can't touch it.
Right. Yeah. It's strange. And yeah, it's based on like a lot of traditions, right? Like traditions that haven't been updated and could use reforming. So I think the core thing there that matters most is removing the sort of individualistic side of things, where it's like one person's tied to one idea or one research project and so on and so forth, and having more infrastructures that allow for collaborations, that allow for inputs from multiple parties without cost to the original person, the first person, let's say. It's like for let's say the early career researcher who does need a publication to show their worth, to extend their career and so on and so forth. So we need structures or ways for people to be able to contribute to collaborative projects in a way that doesn't cost them. So that's the incentive side of things. But at a core level, it's more the community. I think it's like finding the same people who do the same research that you do, or are researching the same kind of thing that you're doing, or the system, or so on and so forth, and being willing to start these conversations and say, hey, let's figure this out together, rather than be adversaries. A lot of science is sort of like adversarial in a way, where it's like, actually, I don't agree with your theory, or I don't replicate your results, or whatever. Like this kind of conflict, and these conflicts generate publications, and like you know, as we talked about, like conflicts are noticeable and stick in people's minds, and so that's a way to game the system, to generate the conflict, be the foil for someone else, and publish against each other without actually making progress. I usually make the quip that you can have very academically productive debates, but not scientifically productive debates. And the fact that those two things are different is like funny. Yeah, so I think it starts with a community-based initiative or just thinking where you reach out to someone who could potentially be an adversary and instead go, no, let's collaborate. Let's work on this thing together. Let's pool our resources or pool our thinking and try and produce something in a way that progresses science or understanding and also progresses both of us equally rather than these first author, my publish, me get into nature or whatever, so on and so forth, nonsense that really takes up our attention and is just not worth thinking about. Yeah, so I think it starts with, like a cultural change and an attitudinal change, which I'm starting to see bubbling up, but eventually, it will take some time for that critical mass to be reached in the neuroscience community, science community at large, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that what you just said about finding collaborators who maybe you're incentivized to be adversarial with and instead trying to work together to generate some new understanding, that makes me feel really hopeful and excited. And I can think of people in my own subfield of neuroscience that I even feel kind of, and I think my PI generally does a great job of being very collaborative, but I think that there's even people who have been discussed as like personalities within my subfields that are like, this person kind of has ownership over this field and they're, perhaps would have a conflict of interest. So you shouldn't suggest them as a reviewer because they're going to get all like
gatekeepy,
staking their territory and gatekeeping who's allowed to study this small area of the brainstem.
It's weird, right?
Yeah, it is weird. Like, what's the harm in reaching out to them and being like, I want to understand this better. I have this like approach to understanding it better. What do you think about that? You obviously have a lot of knowledge. Would you want to like collaborate? Would you want to like advise my project a little bit?
Yeah. Even if it doesn't eventuate in an exact research output or experiment or anything, those conversations or discussions can be like really useful seeds for future stuff or like just simply understanding a perspective or where conflicts may be perceived but may actually not exist. In my field of working memory, there's been a long-standing debate where there were two camps. Broadly, slots versus resources. I won't go into the nuances, and people who know me will know I've ranted about this repeatedly. But it created this like binary situation where you had camps of scientists, people being perceived one way, or if they were, like, you believe the slot theory, you believe the resource theory, and so on and so forth. And at some point, we had to be like, okay, this dichotomy, this debate is silly. And it's really impacting the way we're doing science. Like people are scared of having each other as reviewers and blah, blah, blah. There's really lines being drawn in the sand. Recently, I've been saying like, look, these two things aren't actually mutually exclusive. Like you're all right. Like we're all right in some ways, probably somewhere in the middle. Like why are we binarizing or dichotomizing? And it filters into the students because the students are like, oh, you're on the other side and it's kind of taboo to like actually talk to you. When in reality, it's just like, no, I think you're great and I think the stuff you're doing is cool. I'm just like awkward and don't know how to navigate the situation. So it's really simply starting with a conversation, reaching out, being like, hey, we're both trying to understand this thing. I think what you're doing is interesting and it's definitely relevant to what I'm doing. This is how I'm doing it. Maybe there's something that can be gained from talking to each other or understanding how we're approaching each other's theoretical understanding or purpose with what they're doing. That's super important. And if someone turns you away from that, it's like, again, so antithetical to science, because what is science if not trying to change people's minds and understanding? And if you're not willing to try and understand what someone else is thinking, how can you even have the hope of being able to change someone's mind if you don't understand or you just refuse to understand what someone else is thinking about? This rant is all to say it's rare in science, but I think more people should be doing it, reaching out to potential adversaries and be like, hey, we're doing the same stuff. I'm curious about what you think about this. Let's have a conversation. Even if there's no clear research line in the future, it starts from that. And then eventually you might realize, oh, there's something that we can combine together. Or actually, you might be a great, collaborator or contributor on this project that I have, and I've needed this help. And then eventually we can, catalyze and energize this kind of research.
I think almost, I don't want to say always, but almost whenever there's a dichotomy, it's not true. Like I'm trying to think of like a example we learned about in med school that was about, I think, whether viruses cause cancer or whether like genetic mutations cause cancer. And these two groups were very opposed to each other. They're like, no, viruses cause cancer. No, like random genetic mutations cause cancer, blah, 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 blah. And, we have since come to learn that they're both right. Sometimes viruses can cause cancer, and sometimes random genetic mutations emerge, and sometimes viruses cause the mutations. And yeah, like this dichotomy was not necessary. And perhaps we would have arrived at that conclusion earlier if everybody hadn't been at each other's throats about it.
Right. So some dichotomies are useful, of course, like to think about things and like have a framework to try and discuss and research things. But at some point, the dichotomy needs to be rethought. And people would be like, wait, hang on, what are we talking about again? That kind of thing needs to also happen to divorce one's like position and ego from the specific camp or theory and sort of be a bit more pluralistic. There's a very famous quote. I think it's Watkins. I might get that wrong, so apologies to whoever it's. But it's like, models are like toothbrushes. Everyone uses their one. No one likes to use someone else's. I think about that a lot. I think scientists need to be a bit more willing to use other people's toothbrushes.
Oh.
It's what I mean by that is scientists need to like be able to like see the truth or see that other position or the other model or the other theory and be like, okay, there's probably something right about it. Where don't I agree, or why don't I agree? Or sort of those questions are way more important than dismissing it and being like, oh, that's wrong. Or wait, why haven't I tried that method? Like, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I really love that approach. And I think even non-scientists can kind of adopt this approach when they're reading about and thinking about science and the science that gets communicated to them is like, yeah, adopt. It's so much more of a fun position to be in, I think, to adopt a very open approach and be like, I'm just going to find out about this. It's not tied to me and my self-worth. It's just a thing that's being presented. And, maybe this comes along with education on how to evaluate things on the merits. But like, what's out there? What kind of interesting new things can I learn?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's, a really great message for everyone.
Go forth and learn about things.
Yeah, why not? Why not? I think to try and hammer that point home, one of my favorite modern philosophers, C.T. Nguyen, wrote this paper called The Seduction of Clarity. And it's sort of like when things are clear, it lulls you into a sense of understanding. So like, because something is clear to you, that means like you get it, or that thing is right. And it stops your critical juices. Like you no longer question or rethink. So I think a really nice thing is to try and search for the pockets of unknown, search for the pockets of things where you don't understand or you don't get it. And try and explore those avenues. I think that's a fun place to be.
I think on that note, is there anything else that you hope that people take away from this conversation? As
an attention researcher, my last sort of message would be to really think about what's got your attention and whether that's the thing that you want to capture your attention. Doesn't have to be science related. It could be, are you devoting enough of your attention to your kids, your family, or whatever, your friends, to the other things? And I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves. Even if you're a scientist, is science the thing that should be taking up all your attention? So I think I'd leave on that. I think that's what I want people to take away. Rethink what's on your mind.
Yeah, I love that. And I want people to take away, go forth, form a union, and bring down all of the different systems that are holding us back.
I mean, yeah, also a great message. You've got power and you've got agency. It may not seem like it, but even small impacts, like at the local level or at the individual level, are so important. And they're not alone. If a lot of people take individual actions together, they resonate and can form a critical mass, and the wave of open science and rigorous science could come crashing down on these academic structures that aren't so great or whatever. And we can see progress and reform being made.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. So thank you for agreeing to do this interview and being on the podcast.
No, yeah, thank you for having me. And I hope our audience and you got something out of it.
Yes, I think that was amazing. And so where can people find you in the various different work that you do?
Nowadays, I'm on Blue Sky, which unfortunately, you still need an invite code to get to. But if you can find me on various social media. If you look for me, William Ngiam, I'm one of probably only one in the world, so you'll find me. And feel free to email me. Actually, I'm one of those weird people who encourage emails to my inbox because I'd love to start conversations and discussions. So yeah, if you want to email me, my current email is wngiam, so WNGIAM @uchicago.edu.
Yeah, thank you. And again, yeah, we've been talking with William Ngiam, who is a postdoctoral researcher studying attention and working memory, and who also works on Reproducibility, which is an initiative and also a podcast that talks about reproducibility and rigor in science. So you can also go check out the ReproducibiliTEA. That's with TEA, like the drink.
Yes, the drink, sipping tea, yes.
I have found it to be a very fascinating podcast, and I think probably would be approachable also for non-scientists. I don't think that you all get too technical most of the time.
Yeah, you can hear more about what I'm ranting about on the topics that we covered today in more detail at the ReproducibiliTEA podcast.
Our music is by Sam Brunwasser. You can find more of his work at soundcloud.com/visualsnowbeats. As always, you can download the paper and read the transcriptions at inplainenglishpod.org. And make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's PLAINENGLISHSCI. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for another episode of In Plain English.